black people were shot. They were burned and beaten to death. Bodies were hung on the lampposts. It was one of the bloodiest purges in American history.
People carry that memory as trauma. And I think one of the most important things we should do is to understand that when people don't want to tell stories, it's not because they want to forget it. It's because they don't want to relive it. Those are two very different things.
Despite what recent reports may have you believe, it was the white people who were rioting. St. Louis was becoming what they call a sundown town, which meant you don't want to be here when the sun goes down. On July 2nd, 1917, a mob of white women, men, and children, yes, children, destroyed and burned down at least $400,000 worth of property. This property belonged to not only black people, but to white families as well. This purge was so brutal and savage that it drove 6,000 black men and women out of their homes. Such a massacre couldn't have happened out of nowhere. Something must have triggered it, right? On July 1st, a day before it all blew up, a rumor started to spread that a black man killed a white man. Tensions were running high. Well, if you are familiar with American history, you are well aware of how white supremacists went above and beyond to subjugate black people. In many cases, they would frame black people for murder just to get it their way. But this story hits a whole other level of crazy.
White mobs moved to the neighborhoods, firebombed a lot of the houses, and they would stand around the house and wait for somebody to run out so they could shoot and kill them. You were either shot or you were incinerated. If you were caught on the street, you were lynched. They just rampaged up and down the street, destroying what they could. My grandparents' home, where my father and uncles lived at the time, was destroyed. They had to hide out in a nearby field.
This carnage shocked the nation because it happened soon after U.S. forces entered World War I. So you had black troops leaving their families in April to fight for democracy and make the world a safer place. And then in July, you have black families getting butchered on the streets in the most barbaric ways you could possibly imagine. People were clubbed to death. Children were thrown into flaming houses, and their fathers, mothers, brothers, and sisters dangled from a noose. It was a true horror. This is how the Citizen Committee from East.St. Louis described the race riot. A very orgy of inhuman butchery during which more than 50 colored men, women, and children were beaten with bludgeons, stoned, shot, drowned, hanged, or burned to death, all without any effective interference on the part of the police, sheriff, or military authorities. This massacre wiped out the black middle class in the area, destroyed many black-owned businesses, and scarred the region for the years to come. Here, you will learn what happened on that fateful day. But first, we have to start from the beginning. At the start of the 20th century, many black Americans migrated from the South to the North and Midwest in search of a better life. The South was worse than you can imagine. There was severe hatred, violence, and racism against black people. Lynchings were common. Beatings and subjugation were widespread. There were 3 bathrooms, men, women, and colored. There were 2 fountains, white and colored. Everything was segregated. White people and black folks couldn't marry, or people would threaten to kill them. A black man wasn't allowed to look like a white man, or a mob would attack him. Black women were often sexually assaulted, but there was nothing they could do about it. But if you think that racism was exclusive to the South, then you would be sadly mistaken. Racism was everywhere, but the North and the Midwest offered better choices for employment and some minor relief from Jim Crow laws. East St. Louis was one of these top destinations. It was here that black people could find work for the railroad, metalworking, and meatpacking companies. It was tedious and hard work, but it put food on the table. The demand for workers in such industries was running high, especially companies that supported the war effort. You see, as the war approached, factories and companies had to produce more ammunition, weapons, and other supplies. Some of these men who lived there left the city to fight in the military. This created a gap and a need for more skilled workers. Good, right? Well, not exactly. Many businesses in East St. Louis recruited black workers from the rural South to come and work for them. They offered to transport them and give them jobs. They were also promised to settle in a community where other black people were building their own lives and opening up businesses. By the spring of 1917, around 2,000 black people arrived in East St. Louis every week. What followed was a series of incidents that set the motion for one of the bloodiest massacres on American soil. There were a couple of factors that played a role here. 1, cultural. 2, political. 3, economic. Let's start with cultural. During the Industrial Revolution, newspapers were mass-produced. They were the biggest medium and most commonly used means of altering public opinion. You did not have to be incredibly literate to understand what was going on. The newspaper was designed in such a way that everyone read it, talked about it, and was hooked on it. White people who owned the newspapers and magazines in the area made people think that black Americans were causing chaos in the town and frequently assaulted white people. They downplayed crimes done by white people and invented or exaggerated crimes that involved black people. A lot of residents believed in white supremacy in East.St. Louis. In many of these cases, white women were seen as pure and targeted by black men. When you let things like these continue to happen day in and day out, eventually it will sow a seed of hatred. So, how do you make things worse? With politics, of course.
You can't get more of a segregationist as a Woodrow Wilson. You can't get more of a hatred person or hatred of a person, but in that heart than a Woodrow Wilson. He was the bigot of his time. He didn't try to hide his hatred of African Americans or any person of color. He was the person that did, I think, set back African Americans more than any other person except Abraham Lincoln, who was supposed to be freedom to black folks. But he did more harm to black folks than anybody else in history.
Those at the top believed that black people were brought to East St. Louis to push the Democrats out of office. Look at it this way. When there is an influx of workers that migrate from other areas, the political leaders usually believe that these newcomers will be used in local politics as a strategic move to shift the political power in the city. As more and more black Americans settled, the Democrats felt threatened. That's because black people were beginning to seek representation and influence in the local government and were gaining momentum in challenging the power structure that dominated the area. That's because most of the black Americans at that time supported the Republicans. But if black people were allowed to gain political power and influence, then the Democrats would lose their grip on political control and all the privileges that came with it. So changes had to be made, and fast. The pre-Depression years were extremely good for the people who lived in East St. Louis. The place was booming and many industrialists invested there, especially in steel and iron plants, factories for producing rail equipment, glassworks, and castor oil plants. On top of that, huge industries were planning facilities here for aluminum ore processing, zinc processing, chemicals, you name it. By the early 1890s, it seemed that nothing could stand in the way of East St. Louis and its economy. By 1906, a bunch of rich people invested in opening up their own factories, especially in the automobile industry. This place was so popular that people started calling it the Pittsburgh of the West. Then came the economic problems. Since businesses needed labor, many people from across the United States came here to find work. The city's population went up very quickly. In 1870, about 5,600 people lived here. In 22 years, the number went up to about 25,000. It was the fastest growing city in the U.S. As people flooded the area from every corner, the demographics of the city changed like never before. Most of the incoming population was either immigrants from the South or Europe. In the city's early days, before the industrial boom, not many black people lived here. But by 1910, 1 out of 10 residents were black. By 1917, more than 10,000 black Americans lived here. But there was a problem.
Want to steak it up a notch at Qdoba? Spice up your next entree with habanero lime steaks, tender cut.
There was a growing middle class of black Americans, and white people despised them. This was at a time when black women and men were also competing with white people for jobs, which only added fuel to the fire. In reality, many of the black people who were employed were bought here for cheap labor. Without white money in businesses, crime rates skyrocketed. Violence and corruption were also high. The St. Louis metropolitan area spans across 2 states. It is separated by the Mississippi River, Illinois and Missouri. The Illinois side was always a poor city, but the downtown was pretty active. Many people had businesses here. As the population became primarily black, it damaged the downtown trade. Soon, the east side was overwhelmed with drugs and gangs. It became a political backwater dominated by crime, corruption, and poverty. Democrats blamed the Republicans for colonizing the city with black people so they could get more votes. The businessmen had no choice but to move their businesses to the Missouri side. They built highways to pass over East St. Louis so it would be safe to go over the area. In 1916, the Democrats won for East St. Louis and St. Clair County. But the concept of colonization became so ingrained in the people's minds that they started seeing it as a conspiracy. White people were becoming more and more afraid of East St. Louis becoming another black town. These fears came to life when employers hired black workers to break a strike by white workers. The goal was to weaken the power of the white union members.
Negroes
Here's
to
what
work
happened.
in
In the spring of
a cell
1917,
truck.
a group of white workforce at the aluminum ore company went on strike. The company hired hundreds of black people to take care of it. On May 28, a meeting at the city council was held. The white workers were furious. They filed formal complaints against the black workers. Then, word started to spread that an armed black man attempted to rob a white man. White people lost their minds. They began beating every black person they could find. They went so far as to pull people out of trolleys and streetcars and beat them on the street. The National Guard was called but was dispersed in June. On July 1, a white man with a gun in a Ford shot a couple of black homes. That's when black Americans decided enough was enough. They gathered in a single area, armed, and they opened fire at another coming forward. But what ended up happening was something they never saw coming. The people they killed were two police officers who were headed to investigate the shooting. Now, St. Louis was a ticking time bomb. On July 2nd, all hell broke loose. White people started pouring by the dozens. They beat up the black people with pipes, rocks, and guns. They set fires to any home or business they could find. Anyone who dared to run away at the wrong place and at the wrong time was shot, often at point-blank range. The three-day crisis had just begun. Here is what Dahadi Kennedy said about the Exodus. He is the founder of the Committee for Historical Truth, and although he wasn't there to see it, he learned about it because his father, aunts, and uncles lived through it. Thousands of blacks were streaming across that bridge when what they called the race war got into full swing. When that happened, the police shut down the bridge and no one could escape. Some, in desperation, tried to swim and drowned. It was a manhunt, as if this group of white people were out there to kill for sport. Except they didn't care for fair play. All they wanted was to shoot down as many black people as they could find. People were dragged to the streets and ropes were being put around their necks. If any white man were to protest the lynchings, they would be pushed away by an angry mob. No one could stop the inevitable.
Were there any other stories that they would talk about?
Well, there was the one that I also knew about, and that is that corner around Collinsville Avenue and 4th Street, or down there where the Broadview Hotel is now, or used to be. And I can remember my father pointing out, saying, they hung somebody up there.
Here is an excerpt from a book called Ain't But a Place, an anthology of African American writings about St. Louis. This is a collection of writings from witnesses who experienced the whole thing. These accounts are gruesome, but they are all true. Just a side note, it's not for the faint of heart. It goes like this, and I quote, "Right here I saw the most sickening incident of the evening. To put the rope around a black man's neck, one of the lynchers stuck his fingers inside the gaping scalp and lifted the black man's head by it, literally bathing his hand in the man's blood. A bunch of news articles were published calling it a riot. Many of them depicted the scenes of this exodus. One article explained that the mob used a butcher knife to behead a random black person. We've been brainwashed since birth, but it's time for us to take our power back and realize who we truly are. If you're ready to educate yourself and learn the information they never taught you in school, click the link in our bio to grab our new bundle called Unlock Minds. It includes multiple ebooks breaking down our real history, opens your mind to your true potential, and gives you the blueprint to black power and wealth. Click the link in our description to grab yours now for 80% off before it's too late. Thank you for the support." There was also a 12-year-old black girl who fainted after a bunch of white people pulled her out of a trolley bus. Her mother jumped to help, but the mob turned on her instead, leaving the woman incapacitated with a gaping hole in her head. As Dahadi Kennedy's family was getting ready for a church service on a Sunday morning, they heard that a white mob was headed their way, and what people call the African Quarter was soon going to be bathed in blood. His grandmother called the rest of the family to hide inside. His father, who was a teenager at the time, together with his uncles, was getting ready to fight. Mind you, some of the people who lived there already had military training. They had just come back from World War I. His uncles and some other young black men used a squirrel rifle and guarded the house. If a white mob were to come anywhere near it, they opened fire. But it wasn't easy. Both the white and black men were armed to the teeth. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours. Many of the surrounding homes and businesses were burned to the ground. By the time morning came, the entire neighborhood was set on fire. Kennedy's family lost their footing. They had no choice but to run to the river for cover in the middle of the night. Here is how Kennedy explained it. According to my uncles, it took 4 hours to get across that river. They fashioned a raft out of old doors and charred wood to cross the Mississippi River and get to the St. Louis side. The raft sprung leaks, but they were able to get across. The sky to the east was red at night for days. They could still hear gunshots and screams. Even to this day, Kennedy's family still has to deal with the trauma. His grandmother passed away a couple of weeks after the Exodus. She died from stress and pneumonia from the river crossing. And if a child were to answer the door, they would be told to look out the window first and stand aside, just in case someone is out there waiting with a gun in their hands. From July 2nd to July 5th, roughly 200 black people were hanged, shot, burned alive, or clubbed to death. The massacre left over $400,000 in property damage. That's almost $9.7 million in today's money. About 6,000 black Americans were forced to leave everything behind. That was more than 50% of East St. Louis's black population. President Theodore Roosevelt condemned the purge. In an article from July 7, 1917, for the New York Times, the president said that the event was an appalling outbreak of savagery. The thing is, you can find a bunch of newspaper articles from that time that call it the East St. Louis race riot. It is sad to think that it took more than 100 years for historians to step in and recognize that murdering hundreds of people over the color of their skin is not a riot, it is genocide.
Everyone said I wouldn't find a quality teaching degree online. Everyone except WGU. Their respected school of it.
Recognize that murdering hundreds of people over the color of their skin is not a riot, it is genocide. This is a classic example of how capitalism is fully linked with sexism, racism, and imperialism. How easy it is for the media to dramatize, exaggerate, and villainize whoever or whatever they please. It is events such as these that show us the true meaning of why we need to learn about our history. When Russian envoys came to visit New York on July 6th, Roosevelt explained that the United States was in no place to criticize Russia for violating human rights, not until the U.S. is ready to ensure justice for all Americans. The leader of the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers, explained that these riots were an organized effort to throw the labor conditions in East St. Louis in complete and utter chaos. Gompers explained that the rioting was understandable, mainly because white workers were losing their jobs and they couldn't compete with the cheap labor. On July 2nd, as darkness came, the National Guard was sent in again, but neither the police officers nor the guardsmen could get the situation under control. Many black residents were still suffering or dying on the streets. Many of the white rioters didn't get arrested. Even though the entire place was swarming with white supremacists, only a handful ever stood trial. Amid all that chaos, many of the rioters tried to suppress the media as much as they could. They smashed cameras and pushed reporters away. For example, Maurice Ahern, Mayor Molman's secretary, gave the order that guardsmen and police officers arrest anyone who photographs the killings and beatings or destroy their cameras. But people still managed to take sneaky pictures and publish them for the world to see. Why do you think they went to such lengths to attack photographers and reporters? Would the fallout have been worse if these historical records were made public? It's safe to say that not every newspaper wanted to spread false narratives. Carlos Hurd was a reporter who used to work for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. In an article published on July 3rd, he said, "For an hour and a half last evening, I saw the massacre of helpless Negroes at Broadway and 4th Street in downtown East St. Louis, where a black skin was a death warrant." Just a couple of days after it all started, Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was a popular journalist at the time, traveled from Chicago to East St. Louis to find out what had happened. She saw something no one dared to publish. After collecting statements from black women who had come back to the city to get their homes or collect whatever was left of their property, they were faced with another cruel reality. In her pamphlet called The East St. Louis Massacre, the greatest outrage of the century, she said the police and the state guards either turned a blind eye to the horrors or even helped the mob attack black people. Now this caused huge problems. The Congress had to investigate it. but the U.S. War Ministry decided it was best to censor the pamphlet because they were terrified it would incite another racial conflict since the country was already at war. It took days before the mob calmed down and the violence began to subside. The NAACP was devastated. They sent Martha Groening and W.E.B. Du Bois to investigate the exodus. Together, they wrote a report and dubbed it Massacre at East.St. Louis. It was later published in the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis. But that was not all. On July 28, the NAACP organized a silent protest in the middle of New York City. About 8,000 to 15,000 Black Americans came to show their support. The march started at 57th Street, down 5th Avenue, and ended at 23rd Street. It was the first protest of its kind. The UNIA also responded to the massacre. On July 8, Marcus Garvey issued a statement that said, "This is a crime against the laws of humanity. It is a crime against the laws of the nation. It is a crime against nature, and a crime against the God of all mankind." He also thought that the whole purge was part of a much bigger ploy to harm Black Americans who moved up north to find better jobs and live a better life. He called it a bloody farce. After a year had passed, the United States House of Representatives formed a special committee to investigate what the police were doing in the middle of the riot. Investigators discovered that both the police force and the National Guard hadn't done enough to protect Black people. They found out that police often ran away from places where the mob was murdering Black people or setting things on fire. Some even ditched the station houses and ignored cries for help. A couple of police officers were charged, and that's it. In reality, the investigation sounded like it was blaming the victims. As Marcus Garvey so eloquently puts it, an investigation of the affair resulted in the finding that labor agents had induced Negroes to come from the South. I can hardly see the relevance of such a report with the dragging of men from cars and shooting them. President Roosevelt and Gompers almost came to blows because they disagreed about who should be blamed for the massacre. Roosevelt insisted that the people who caused the violence should be punished and held accountable. Gompers stood up to speak and shared a message he got from the president of the Federation of Labor of Illinois. The message said that the East.St. Louis riots weren't caused by labor unions, but by employers bringing Black workers from the South to break the back of labor. This pissed the president off. He jumped up and came face to face with Gompers, put his hand on his shoulder and said that there should be no excuse for the atrocities Black people had to suffer. Here's the irony. The U.S. just joined World War I and was claiming to promote justice and freedom, and yet here they were, killing their people. Many cartoonists in American newspapers talked about this. East St. Louis wasn't the only city in the North where race riots happened during this time. Some Black people started to believe they couldn't rely on white communities or the government, whether in the North or the South. No one was there to protect them. It was time to fight for their rights. Here is a statement from W.E.B. Du Bois that can give you a perfect example of the state of mind of many Black Americans who lived during that period. It said, "Today, we raise the terrible weapon of self-defense. When the murderer comes, he shall no longer strike us in the back. When the armed lynchers gather, we too must gather armed. When the mob moves, we propose to meet it with bricks and clubs and guns." Sadly, it had to come to this. Black Americans would no longer be caught unprepared. No matter what was standing in their way, they had to come together and fight against all odds. The cog was now turning. What many of us fail to see is that the racism of the United States history is mainly focused on the South. But when you take a look at all the different cities across the North and Midwest, you will realize that racism is everywhere. You can throw and burn the photographs, but history will always be there. As long as that knowledge gets passed on from generation to generation, it will never be forgotten. It was total madness. Even though this is a dark chapter in American history, it's important to look a little deeper and understand where our ancestors truly came from. Just imagine how many stories like this one are still untold. How many people died that day but were never recorded because their bodies were never recovered. It's important that we educate ourselves, learn from these stories, and make sure to never repeat the same mistakes.
Facts.
What do you think about the East St. Louis massacre? Do you have any stories that your grandparents or parents told you? Anything that you would like to share? As always, thank you for watching and see you in the next video.